On today's World Insight, a tribute to fallen World War II heroes on the 75th anniversary of the Great War, China's contribution to ending the global conflict at an enormous cost in lives and livelihood. And we turn back the pages of Schindler's Ark, the acclaimed World War II novel turned blockbuster, up close and personal with the Schindler's Ark author, Thomas Kenley.
People have died in great numbers, and they deserve that their deaths shouldn't be written off simply.
Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing. I'm Tian Wei. September the 3rd marks the 75th anniversary of the Allied victory over Japan in World War II, a deep scar in history that left tens of millions of people dead. Chinese President Xi Jinping and other top officials paid tribute to war heroes on Thursday. Before we get down to a discussion with quite a few from different parts of the world of this specific occasion, let's take a look at this.
Flowers, wreaths, and tribute. This morning, Chinese President Xi Jinping and senior officials commemorated China's fallen heroes. At the Museum of the War of Chinese People's Resistance Against Japanese Aggression, veterans, family members of martyrs, and representatives from across the country gathered. The war against Japanese aggression lasted 14 years. It was an important part of the worldwide struggle against fascism. During the 14-year period, China lost over 35 million soldiers and civilians. The country's direct economic losses reached $100 billion at the 1937 exchange rate. Japan formally surrendered in 1945. The victory came at a heavy price and earned China respect from the rest of the world. Today, Chinese commemorate the heroic sacrifices, and the messages remember history, not hatred.
For more on the world commemorating the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II, we are joined in Bethesda, Maryland, Peter Kuznick, professor and director at the Nuclear Studies with the Institute in American University. In Washington, D.C., Anton Fedashin, professor of history from the American University, and also in Beijing, Rong Ying, vice president of a CIIS, China Institute of International Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. This is a special day. None of us ever lived in that war. However, we heard so much about that war. Tell me about one or two stories or moments you remembered from history regarding that part of our time. Mr. Fedashin, if you can.
Sure. My stories of World War II, of course, come down from my grandparents in the Soviet Union, as does the memory of that war. And the thing that really stands out always is the fundamentally different experience of that war in Greater Eurasia, which was a war of extermination, colonization, and enslavement. And it's very important to remember these facts because in many ways, there is a fundamental difference between the way that East Europeans and the Chinese experienced this conflict and the way that the Americans did, who were only attacked directly on their own soil during the tragedy of Pearl Harbor. But when you compare the losses, which you mentioned in your introduction, to the losses of the Chinese and the Soviet people, the Soviet Union lost 26.6 million, to the best of our knowledge. These are almost incommensurate figures.
Mr. Kuznick, what about your own personal experience and memories of that part of history, given possibly your interactions with your parents and your grandparents?
Well, my perspective comes from the fact that most of my relatives were killed in the Holocaust before I was born. So my earliest memories are about one aspect of World War II, and that's the viciousness of Nazi Germany. But as a historian, when I study World War II, I'm very depressed by the mythology that still exists. There are three fundamental myths. One is that the United States won the war in Europe, when of course the Soviets get the credit for defeating Nazi Germany. The second fundamental myth is that the atomic bombs forced Japanese surrender and ended the war. And the reality, of course, is that it was actually the Soviet invasion that forced the Japanese to surrender, not the atomic bombs. And the third myth is that the Cold War started during World War II because of Soviet aggression. And that is also a part of the history that Americans don't understand, and which they're consumed with very, very false ideas. And all of these have very dangerous long-term ramifications that I hope we get to talk about today.
Very interesting. Both of you talk about the misconceptions about war and how war are being shaped by politics or rhetorics later. Mr. Rong, what about your personal experience with World War II, especially China's war then against the Japanese aggression? 30 million people lost their lives.
Yeah, I think my personal experience is to some extent quite similar to the two previous speakers. I think given the fact that my generation was born after the World War II, after, in the case of China, the Chinese people's war against Japanese aggression. So a lot of stories learned, my knowledge learned from stories, movies, and others, and textbooks as well. So like every Chinese, I think we learned that this war, the People's War against Japanese aggression, is a hard one, and we shed a lot of blood, and we owe so much to our martyrs. And equally important is that I think we also appreciate that the allies countries like the United States, Soviet Union, and others have been supporting China's war against Japanese aggression and fought side with us. As a student of international politics, we also learned that after the war, the victory of the war, the UN, the United Nations, was formed, and this is the very purpose of that is to prevent the repetition of that scale of war, which is, I think, equally important and relevant in this context.
Of course, you are all experts and historians, but my experience with the war comes very personal. I have a grandma from my mother's side. She lived in then, at the time, Manchuria, but of course it's northeast part of China. That part of the country first experienced the invasion of the Japanese forces during the 1930s and probably earlier than that. And she told me about her younger days, what it was like to run around, just be away from the bullets and also from death. So it's very interesting that we have very different memories of the war, even though none of us were directly linked to that war. And yet it all left a scar of one kind or another on all of us too, even though we were not in that war. So this brings a very interesting and I think profound question. What is war? And why did we have it? And when we know we had war and we suffered as a whole, no matter which side you are on, why do we still have it, and why there is still advocacy about a potential war? Seems to be the favorite entertainment by some still in our world today. I want to tap into our expertise about all these questions as we go on our discussion today. Mr. Kuznick, I don't want to say you're coming from the United States, so what about your U.S. view? Mr. Fidachian, I don't want to say, oh, you're coming from originally Russia, so what about your view? Mr. Rong, I don't want to say, oh, you're coming from China, so what about the China perspective about the war? Because we all experienced that war. And as a host of the program, I already talked too long for a monologue. So today, let's be fair, and let's focus on us together. Mr. Kuznick, did we learn from war?
No, we haven't learned the lessons of the war. It's very sad, but the world is still armed to the teeth. Countries still threaten each other. The bullet and the atomic scientists placed the hands of the doomsday clock at 100 seconds before midnight. That's how close we are to nuclear annihilation. They began the clock back in 1947. The closest it's ever been is right now, 100 seconds before midnight. We look at the situation around the world. U.S. relations with China, U.S. relations with Russia, India and Pakistan, China and India. We have one hotspot after another that could explode. And a world that's so heavily armed, in which military forces are in such advanced positions now, to allow these conflicts to develop this way is unconscionable. You have to remember that after the Cuban Missile Crisis, what Kennedy and Khrushchev learned from that crisis was that once one of these crises begins to develop, it's impossible to control them. And the two of them in the next year did everything they could, as Khrushchev said, let's eliminate every conflict between us that could cause another crisis like that. We don't have that kind of leadership in the world now. We've got countries that are viewing it very nationalistically, very selfishly. Every country wants to build up its own armed forces, threaten everybody else, look out for its own interests, and that's exactly the opposite of what we need in the world today.
Have we learned from the wars and the war that we are talking about today, Professor Kardashian?
Tianwei, yeah, let me support what Peter just said by reminding everyone that the two men that he mentioned, Kennedy and Khrushchev, both fought in the Second World War. And he's absolutely right about the nationalization and the politicization of war, because as the memory of it recedes and as reinterpretations of how it began, how it proceeded, and what its end meant for different countries are introduced, the experience of that kind of total catastrophe recedes, or it's papered over, and the new generations of politicians that are in charge of the world today have no memory of the danger of that kind of destructiveness. It's interesting that the Cold War, which is certainly not a period you can point to and say this was a period of safety and stability, was nonetheless a safer international environment, because the men, and it really was mostly men who constructed it in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, remembered the horrors of the Second World War. Today, when you look at television, wars have become very distant, they've become virtual, they've become very good business, very profitable business, and you just have to look at the American war in Afghanistan, which is by far the longest in American history. Nothing else even comes close, 19 years now. And yet, it is a very distant reality for the overwhelming majority of Americans, because it's fought on the other side, it's not present. It's fought virtually in many cases. Soldiers with joysticks in Arizona, striking targets in Afghanistan. And this kind of warfare, modern, hybrid warfare that all countries engage in, has really made this brinkmanship so much more dangerous.
I see. Mr. Rong, have we learned from the war? The same question to you.
Yeah, I think first of all we have to say that despite the fact that the dangers of war is always there, and if you look at the past 75 years, we have to say we are fortunate that we have never so far a kind of world war, the so-called the danger is always the Third World War, But even though we have quite a lot of regional wars, local conflicts, and so on. So this is that's a good question and reason for that. For that, I think certainly I think we human beings, at least that so far we have learned some lessons from the two previous world war that has been bring about so many damages and casualties to mankind, particularly after the introduction, the development of atomic nuclear weapons. I think the human being, the Earth, cannot afford a kind of war like that. That is probably, I think, one of the reasons for that. The other thing is, of course, I think the organizations like United Nations, the principles and the purposes, and also that has been followed, and which helps to manage the conflicts and advocating kind of peaceful management and the resolution of the conflict for that. And also, I think we have to recognize there are statements and from countries in the world that has been working very hard to advocate a kind of peace instead of war. And the problem, the danger is that, as the two previous speakers has been alluded, and to some extent I agree, that we seems that entering into a period and a state where people are easily and loosely talking about war. Yeah. This is very much, I think, a danger.
And you talk about three major words that I have identified together with your colleagues earlier. One is deterrence. Because of nuclear weapons, we all have deterrence toward one another in terms of a hot, large-scale war, and therefore we tend to be much more careful than we used to be in terms of war. Second, you talk about platforms, international platforms in which we could talk to one another, discuss, and probably to resolve, at least to a certain extent, some differences. Third, you talk about statesmen who have been experiencing wars, but at the same time, who have been trying the hardest to avoid wars. Now, do we have, Mr. Kuznick, those conditions anymore? In other words, are we on the brink of having another hot war? We saw these words have been the frequent and the most popular phrases for some politicians these days around the world, not just in one country, in quite a number of countries.
What you've got right now is a lot of posturing, but also a lot of emphasis on the militaries. All 9 nuclear powers are currently modernizing their nuclear forces. Obama began this in the United States when he announced a 30-year, trillion-dollar modernization of every aspect of the nuclear arsenal and delivery systems. The estimate is now at least $1.7 trillion. China is building up its military in an unprecedented way. China already has the biggest navy in the world. Their defense systems, missile defense systems, are first class. But Russia, on March 1st, 2018, Vladimir Putin, in his State of the Nation address, announced that Russia now had 5 new nuclear weapons, all of which could circumvent U.S. missile defense. India, under Modi, every one of these countries is having the same playbook right now. So instead of thinking about how we tamp down the tensions, how we act as statesmen, how we rely on diplomacy, how we find our common interests, which we have, we're instead actually intensifying the conflicts and moving closer and closer toward confrontation.
Okay.
In January 2018, the United States...
Go ahead, sir. You want to finish that sentence.
In January 2018, the United States announced that its main security threat was no longer international terrorism, it was Russia and China. And if you look at the report that the Pentagon just put out this week about China's military prowess, it's all confrontational rhetoric. It's all talking about China's buildup and how the U.S. has to counter this. We see what's happening in the South China Sea right now, which is very, very tense. That could explode at any time. And so instead of thinking about our common interests, instead of having leaders who approach the crises from the standpoint of humanity as a global population, what we have are people thinking in very nationalistic terms, and that's what gets us in this kind of trouble.
Mr. Rong, you want to respond to that, even though we only have 1.5 minutes for you and the other speaker?
Yeah, I think very briefly, I think the United States, as now the sole superpower, need to, I think, come into the terms to the fact that I think there are, the rises and the development of like new emerging economy like China. And the rise of China and other emerging economies are opportunities, not threat meant to undermine its supremacy. This is, I think, a fundamental issue have to come to terms with.
And China? What about China's mentality? Briefly, if you can.
Well, China certainly, I think, as we traditionally, it's been always upholding a kind of a peace and pursue the policy of peaceful development. And of course, China also needs, again, to maintain certain sort of level of welfare to ensure its self-interest and legitimate rights will be maintained. But China made it very clear it is pursuing and always pursuing a policy of peaceful development.
Professor Fedashian, your two other speakers leave you with only about 45 seconds, if you can, sir. I know it's too short for a historian.
Jianwei, I'll do my best. Let me address one of the three that you mentioned, which is statesmanship. I have to tell you that there really is not much in terms of statesmanship that can smooth over and avoid this kind of conflictual dialogue, or conflictual narrative, I should say, in the West. You know, it's interesting, we started this conversation with the Second World War, and even throughout the Cold War, with the existential standoff between the Soviets and the Americans, for the Soviet Union, World War II, strangely, was this remarkable era of cooperation between very incompatible powers, Great Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union. And the Soviet leadership constantly looked back to that time when they could find a common language of mutual respect and mutual cooperation.
Right.
That kind of attitude is lacking mostly, unfortunately, from Washington in relation to Moscow and Beijing these days. So once the cooperation led by statesmen and dialogue and diplomacy come back to center stage, I think we'll see a change in the world.
We already have a common war to fight. That is the war against the pandemic. Unfortunately, troops are not rallied on this cause, and people are not making their best efforts to fight on the battleground. I'm so much afraid that we're going to miss this battle, the most important battle of our generation. But I want to thank you, the three of you, sharing your insights wherever you are coming from. I hope we all remember the lessons of the war, and we can help others to also enlighten what we have today. Thank you so much. Peter Kuznick, Anton Fedashian, Rong Ying. Thank you, gentlemen.